Good afternoon, and good morning, and good night, as the case may be. This is the first recorded lecture. As I explained in class, we're going to do sort of a hybrid class. Some people call it flipped learning. I won't get into the details too heavily on the theory behind it, but basically, rather than just talking to you constantly in class and giving you the material by lecturing and you listening, then you have the freedom to go online and watch this lecture at your leisure whenever it suits you best. This is my house. I'm in my house. Sometimes I'm going to lecture from here. Sometimes I'm going to be in my office. Normally it's going to be my office, but I do have a whiteboard in my house. So why not? Why not? Today, the most important thing is to do the sort of reorientation, because we already did an orientation, but I do have to repeat a few things that are very important for the entire class to know, because there were first year students, freshmen were busy doing other things, doing their MT, membership training, for those of you who are not Korean, where they're doing their orientation for going to university, and they didn't attend class. So I want to make a few things clear. All of the information, basic information about the class is on the syllabus, which you can access through the CNU portal. So log in there and you can see my contact information, my office number, my email address, and my phone number for emergencies only. Otherwise, I will see you in class. Wednesday's class is going to be online for the entire semester, and I will be doing a lecture every week for the cyber lecture part of the course, which is Wednesday. So you do not have to come to campus unless we have, for example, we schedule the midterm on Wednesday. That's a possibility. If that is the case, I will let you know a week or two in advance. Otherwise, here we are. Most important thing is, this is the textbook. It's the most important thing to tell you today. Please buy the textbook. I will be referring to it constantly. It is my textbook, as you can see by the name. I wrote it, and I wrote it after I started teaching this class. So, you know, I've been teaching this class 3 or 4 years, and then I was offered a chance to write this textbook. The Korean government provided a grant, which basically means they gave me some money to do this project, and this is what I created. There are several versions floating around. The first version, the first edition, was 5 years ago. You can tell the quality has improved just by the outside of it. The first edition had a pretty weak cover design. I did this cover design. I blended these flags together. It's my own creation, and all the images are public domain, as I said, in the book. So there are some pictures to help you visualize some of the ideas, and they're all, not copyrighted. They're public domain images. So please get this book. The writing is all my own. There's lots of references at the back of the book. You can see a whole bunch of statistics. And then at the very end, there's a bibliography, as any good textbook should have. And there's a list of books that I refer to. And it's actually not a complete list. There's a number of things that I would like to improve in the book, but there is a long list. Encyclopedia Britannica is one of the resources I used. Now, of course, you can get a lot of this information online. I have a particular perspective, as I said, because I am a Canadian student and now a Canadian professor. I'm still a student, actually. I'm doing my PhD. So The information has its sources. It's very important when you do your work in class to acknowledge where you get your ideas. I I have some original ideas in here, but for the most part, other people influenced me. Many different writers and professors, and some of them are probably not in the list, and I should put more people on the list because there's a lot of people that are not included. But anyway, at the end of the book, there is a bibliography, which are the primary and secondary sources that I used to make the book. Some sources are more influential than others. There's about 50 of them. Okay, so let's talk about this class and what this class is supposed to do. British and American culture have a certain position in history and in culture that is significant, especially over the last few hundred years. And as I explained, there's a lot of people from different countries in this class. There are no British or American students in this class, which means all of us are looking at it from the outside. So I do want to kind of give you some insight into what it would be like if you were American or you were British, which I'm not. But being Canadian, I'm half British and half American and half Canadian. That I know that doesn't mathematically make sense, but that's sort of our identity is a split identity or a composite identity, whatever way you want to put it. I think the Canadian identity has become its own thing recently, within my lifetime, starting to become more obvious what it means to be a Canadian. We're trying to define ourselves. But I think Canadians historically have identified as being British, but heavily influenced by American culture, and then more and more so, you know. I grew up speaking like an American and writing, spelling with the British curriculum and the British spelling system. So it's a complicated thing. But because of the influence of these two cultures globally, we are studying it. I'm not saying that they're better or the best or anything like that, but I want to emphasize certain things that there are good things, there are positive things, and there are negative things about every place. And I always say, when it comes to political stuff, I try not to be on one side or the other. Being unbiased is very important as a professor. I'm not going to be on one side religiously or politically. That's not the point of the class. I want you to be able to examine. I want you to be able to understand how we approach looking at cultures and how we compare them. It's not something that you can avoid. It's just something that it's part of your life. Some people say I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of family who feel very strongly about voting. Some people don't vote because they don't like any of the people, but I mean, the essence of voting is just expressing your opinion. Whatever way you cast your vote, it's important that you vote. And when there's when there's a process in your country where there's no voting, or there is voting, or people don't vote, that means something. That means something, and that's really it's not just British and American, but the British and the Americans feel very strongly about representation, and I think all of you want to represent yourselves. The Koreans especially feel very strongly that South Korea is a republic where there should be justice and there should be personal expression. Whatever country you've come from, as you become more educated, I think you also feel like you want to be able to represent your opinion somehow. And One of the ways that you can do that is by voting. If somebody doesn't allow you to vote or doesn't give you choices when you vote, then you can't express yourself. This is part of the Western tradition. This is part of the British and American cultural experience. Where that comes from and how it developed is very complicated, and it's different in every country, which is fine. So I just want to inform you, and you can make your own decisions. Perspective is one of the most important things about this class. I'm not trying to overload you with a whole bunch of historical stuff and information. I just want you to look and see, all these things combine and they influence me, even though you don't realize it, even though you're not conscious, you're not aware that all these things happen. When you're young in Korea, my son is in elementary school. When he was in kindergarten, he came home to me and told me all these great things about Lee Seung-shin, right? For those of you who are not Korean, maybe in English we write his name like this, or like Lee Seung-shin, like that. Maybe there's no H sometimes. Anyway, his name's Lee Seung-shin. If I got that wrong, then I don't know if I get kicked out of Korea, but hopefully this is the most famous Korean figure historically. He's a hero, if you don't know who he is, and he saved Japan essentially from a Japanese invasion about 400 years ago. And he learned about him in kindergarten. He came home and told me all about the Kabuksan and the Panoksan and fighting Japan and Imjinwedan. These are all things that I don't speak Korean very well, but these are things that everybody in Korea knows from when they're young. So if you really want to understand Koreans, you need to know Sejong, right? He's the other guy. When you ask a Korean who's the greatest Korean of all time, 90% of Koreans are going to say Lee Seung-shin or King Sejong. And then the rest of them are unique and they have their own opinions. I like Gwang Gae-to. Lee Seung-shin is my number one favorite, but Gwang Gae-to is also a king. He was a king like King Sejong. He's a great King Sejong. And Gwang Gae-to was a great king too, and he was a general, and he defeated a gigantic Chinese army that was invading Korea more than 1,000 years ago. These are the kinds of things that if you really, really want to understand, you have to understand K-pop, you have to understand K-dramas, you have to understand the Korean Civil War, the Korean War. You have to understand the Japanese occupation of Korea and the colonial period. These things will allow you to understand Korean culture better. If you have no idea, all Koreans do know that stuff. So it's the same thing for us. If you want to know about British and American culture, you have to know some of the historically significant events. So we started out last class. I just asked people, what do you think of first when you think of British culture? And we got some good answers. Soccer, sports, right? Pub, somebody talked about pub culture. I think that was after class, actually. He approached me talking about that. There's so many things. It depends on what you've heard. I mentioned Harry Potter. I mentioned Rolls Royce. Nobody said rain. Nobody said rain, and nobody said umbrellas, and nobody said Burberry. That's usually, people say different things every semester, so it's interesting. And when we get halfway through the course, I'm going to ask you the same question, what comes to your mind when you think of American culture? So on the British side, to go back to the introduction to the course, on the British side, as I said, there's especially for the business students, the students that are from the business department, Asia Business Department, branding is a business concept you know, when people talk about branding, they're talking about creating a name that has value, right? Has monetary value. And to a certain extent, the Americans and the British are the best at branding. Now, branding, right? You know the word brand. It literally means, though, brand literally means burning something, a certain symbol into the skin of something that you own. So, like in the past, the Americans, for example, if you had cows, I would put my signature, right, which is looks something like that. I would make a hot iron poker. I would make the poker out of iron, and I would heat it up, and then I would burn it into the cows, so that if anybody tried to steal my cows, I would say, "Oh no, that's says Jeremy on that cow. That's my cow. Give it back." They ended up branding people in many cases, right? The people had it on their neck or on their back or on their shoulder, had a brand, because we human beings were property of people. And one way to say that that slave belonged to you was to burn that mark into their skin. So I mean, the history of branding, the word brand has, just like many of the things we're going to talk about, there is some pretty dark and pretty negative associations with it. Branding now is a totally different thing. It's supposed to be like the reputation and the value of a company or a product or a service, right? But the name itself, the name that you choose, you have to be conscious. You have to be conscious of that. My son is named Edward. One of the reasons his name is Edward is because I like British history. And I chose the name because of what it means, and without thinking about the historical context of the royal family or particular King Edwards that might have been good or bad people. I didn't really think about that. And my wife is Korean, and I tried 100 different names. Edward was not my first choice. I tried so many names. She rejected all of them. And then when I said Edward, she was like, I like that. I like the sound of that. That is the reason. That is the number one reason, is because a Korean woman liked the sound of the name. But Edward is Edvard, right? Sounds a lot more German or Viking when I say it like that. And I will explain why it sounds that way, because it means guardian of wealth. Okay? So Ed in Old English means wealth. And Vard is ward. Ed Ward. Warden. Ward means protect. We still use this word. A ward, like we have in Canada, we have a park warden. A park warden, that person's job is to protect the park. So like you go in a national park, you're not supposed to burn things. You're not supposed to damage the trees. You're not supposed to hurt the animals. You're not supposed to leave garbage on the ground, because you're damaging nature. The park warden's job is to make sure that people follow the rules in the park. So Edward, right? Edward, which is my son's name, Edward Sullivan. That name means wealth guardian. Wealth guardian. And you can see Warden sort of resembles guardian, right? Sort of resembles. I'm sort of on the wrong side of the map here. So you can understand so many different things. Every time we look at something, it's good for you to take note of these different aspects, right? This different way of looking at things. Look at something from a historical perspective. Look at something from a cultural perspective, or look at something from a social perspective. So one of the most important things, this is on page 38, okay? Page 38 to page 41. Okay? You need to read these pages. I'm not giving you real homework, but this is going to be tested, and then this is going to be part of your assignment. So you have to make sure you understand this stuff. We're not doing a lot of theory, but there is cultural theory, which means it means a lot of things. It means how to understand, how to study culture. We have the same thing for every subject. We have educational strategy, right? So this, from page 38 to 41, you need to look at the context. It's just a simple way. It's not a complicated thing, but sometimes, these kind of ideas or concepts, when English is not, you're not talking in your first language, it can be a little bit tricky, okay? So cultural studies is a field of English, and this is what our class is. This is not a history class. This is not a literary class. This is a class about culture. It's cultural studies. So what is the main approach? How do you look at things? It's the same thing as when you go to an economics class and they teach you about microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? The big picture and the detailed small picture. Small businesses, management of small things, or talking about national economies or the global economy. There's different ways of separating the information and the material and the tools you use to study economics. I'm talking to the Asia business students here, but whatever field you're studying in our case, if you're studying literature, if you're an English major and you're studying literature, you have to have some sort of strategy to understand it, right? Are you talking about British literature or American or Canadian or Irish, right? Whatever. And what are we talking about here? Are we talking about ideas that are related to feminism, that are related to women? Are we talking about ideas that are related to imperialism, the domination of other peoples and countries and having power located in yourself? Are we talking about nationalism, where you're trying to create an identity that everybody taps into in an area? And how do you do that? How do you create that? And is that what your goal is? And is that what it means? So you look at the cultural things the same way. Social context is the first one I have here. So although I'm making a mess of my board as usual, social context is the first one. I've got a picture of Abraham Lincoln here. Doesn't matter if it's a person, place, or thing. Doesn't matter what we're talking about. But in social context, there is a word in French and many, many words in English. I'll explain why there's so many French words in English, but about a quarter of the vocabulary in English is French-based. So you've got, 200,000 words in English. So it's not surprising when you come across something like chef, right? Which is clearly not how you would say that in English. It'd be chef, but you say it the French way, right? And if you're American, you say foyer, but that is a terrible way of pronouncing that. It's foyer, and foyer is a lobby in a building. It's the big front area, which you first come into at the entrance of a school. If it's a hotel, it's usually called a lobby, but if it's another building for a different purpose, it's called a foyer. These are words that French people made, and that English people thought were good words to use to signify certain things. So milieu means in the middle. Cultural milieu, not to be confusing because there's cultural context, but social context means you're in the middle. It means you're in a situation. So Abraham Lincoln, if we're talking about Abraham Lincoln and you're talking about social context, what you're talking about is when he was alive, what was it like to live in 1860 at the beginning of the Civil War? Who were his friends? Who were his enemies? What was happening? The Gettysburg Address, his decisions, the things that happened during his life, while he was alive. That is called milieu. Social milieu. Sometimes people call it cultural milieu. But we'll just call it social milieu because we don't want to get confused with cultural context. Which is the next part of this way of understanding. Now, I'm going to talk about this at the beginning of Friday's class. So if you have questions, hold your questions until Friday and then ask the questions. This is why I said you should watch this video before Friday, because I'm going to talk about stuff. I'm going to refer to things in the Wednesday lecture. If you don't watch it, you won't know what I'm talking about, and I will answer the questions, and then you'll be confused. It's better to watch before the Friday class. So when it comes to cultural context, we're talking about ideology, we're talking about traditions and values, the things that you need to know about a culture. Like, what do people believe? Symbolism. These are all so for example, we'll just keep going with Abraham Lincoln, even though the picture in the textbook is an English breakfast. If you're talking about cultural context in the English breakfast, you're not talking about the baked beans, the eggs, the sausages, how long it took you to make them. That's social context. What you're talking about is, what does it mean that this is an English breakfast? What do they need? They want energy, right? They want a heavier breakfast, I think, compared to a Korean breakfast. Why is it doing that? I might have to... Okay. That was an alarm going off on my iPad. I don't think I'll cut that out, because this is what happens in class, in real class. So sometimes things get interrupted. I'm not going to start this video over when we're at 27 minutes. But English breakfast is supposed to give you like the foundation for the day. So it's a lot of food. It's pretty heavy. There's beans and sausages and eggs and bread and stuff. And some people from other countries, I don't actually like to have a big breakfast usually. If I'm going to have an English breakfast, I'm going to eat that at like 10 o'clock. It's going to be brunch. I would never eat an English breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't think English people do either. But anyway, we're talking about, what does it mean? It's for energy. It's because you have hard work, because it's functional. It doesn't look pretty. An English breakfast isn't like a beautiful tray of like raw fish, like sashimi, or in Korean, I think you say hoe, right? It doesn't look pretty. It's not arranged nicely. It's just a pile of food: blood pudding, eggs, beans, bread, potatoes, and get it in you, and get out there and work on the railroad. I think the Irish people had to share in that experience, because the Irish people were often the people working on the railroads. But that's called an English breakfast. It's a quite heavy breakfast, and the meaning of it, I'm not saying what the items are in it. I'm talking about energy and hard work and functionality, not worrying about what it looks like. French food is completely different. That's why nobody said, usually people say fish and chips, because that's a very famous British food, representative food, but nobody said anything about food in class. It's probably one of the first times nobody did say fish and chips, but it's always funny when somebody says fish and chips. I'm like, what other food do you know that's British? And everybody's like, that's it. Why is that? It's because food isn't the famous thing. That's not something that the British focused on in that way, right? Food is essential. I said to the person who asked me, where does the British pub culture come from? One of the reasons is because English people had a lot of food. They had a lot of wheat, they had a lot of barley, they had a lot of grain, The climate is very favorable for growing cereals in England, where other countries had, hot and cold things happening. Italy and Spain, like Europe is kind of famous for that Mediterranean climate in the south, and then they have in the north they have the Gulf Stream. So like North Spain is moderated by the water, which warm water comes from Mexico all the way across the Atlantic, and that makes basically it makes the weather milder. England gets that benefit as much as any other country does. So you don't get snow in England. You get tons of cold weather in Scotland. That's one of the reasons, in addition to the rocky terrain, that Scotland has a smaller population and doesn't attract people as much. It's beautiful, natural land, and it doesn't have that many people on it, so that makes it even better. But that's why there's so many people that live in southern England. That's where they live on the British Isles are the 90% of the population is not 90%, close to 90% though. 60 million people live in the United Kingdom, and 90% of that population lives in southern England. Ireland is depopulated for a variety of reasons, but Ireland gets that benefit too. Southern Ireland, or the whole island it gets snow occasionally, but it's a mild summer, so it's not a very hot summer, and it's not a very cold winter, compared to Canada, where if you live in Eastern Canada, like Montreal, where I lived for 4 years, it's like 30 degrees in the summer and minus 30 in the winter. It's extreme. And those of you who live in Central Asia, you know what I'm talking about. North Korea is the same. You get hot weather in the summer and you get freezing cold temperatures in the winter. If you live in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or Ukraine or Russia, you get some hot temperatures in the summer. It gets pretty hot. In the winter, it gets extremely cold, which is not as good for the plants or humans. So that's cultural context. You got to think about the ideology, the traditions, the values, the symbolism of what you're talking about. Historical context is actually connected to the events that contribute to that thing, whatever it is. So again, we'll go back to Abraham Lincoln. The reason that Abraham Lincoln was the president during the Civil War is because in 1776, the British citizens of New England and the 13 colonies, including New England, they decided to separate and fight a war against the British Empire, which they won. And when they made the Constitution, they included a clause because some of the states had slaves and wanted to make sure that the other states who didn't have very many slaves didn't have an advantage. So they made it so, but they didn't want to give power to their slaves because they were property. So they made a decision that slaves would be worth 3/5 of a person, which doesn't make sense at all. In reality, morally or ethically, doesn't make sense. But if you want to understand where they're coming from, if I was a slave owner and I had 100 slaves, then I would be able to vote with the power of 60 people. That would balance, because there were so many people in the southern states who they didn't want to give the right to vote, but they still wanted to represent the power of the state by a proportion of the people that were living in that, so that you ended up with two things. You had those 3/5 of a person being represented by the owner of those people, and then you had what we call the Electoral College, which means the upper house in the United States. Each state, no matter how big or small, sends 2 delegates. So they're completely balanced. So New York, or California or Texas, they have a lot of people. So they have more representatives in the lower house. But in the upper house, they all have two. So even though Rhode Island and Delaware are tiny states with small territories and small economies and small people, they still send two people. They still send two senators. So New York has no more power than California, or less power than Rhode Island or Alaska. No matter what the characteristics of the state, they all get equalized in the Senate. And American people thought that was a good thing. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not. Because it means a few states or some states might represent a small number of the people and this a small interest in some issue. They can block or they can push forward their own ideas. That's a historical thing. All of those things happened before. Abraham Lincoln wasn't alive yet. It had nothing to do with him, but he had to he had to grow up in a log cabin, and he had to get trained as a lawyer, and then he became president, and then he had to deal with the consequences of these decisions. When the Constitution was written, a number of intelligent American people said, this is setting us up for a civil war. We're going to end up fighting each other over this. We allowing this sort of contradiction between the values of, a free state and a democratic country, and at the same time accommodating this sort of ethically and morally wrong institution, slavery, including that, in writing that all people are created equal and have the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and then saying, except women and black people and native people and Mexicans and everybody else. Oh, wait a second. What you're doing, you're sowing the seeds of discord. You're making a situation where the country is going to be divided on that basis. You're going to divide people. Eventually, it's going to be divided by race. And some people are going to see that as wrong, and some people are going to protect it because economically they're so invested in it that there's sort of, some of them are bad people, some of them are terrible people, and some of them are supporting a system that is the basis of their society. So like a social institution that they can't get rid of easily. So that's important to read. And you need to read about, right after that, you need to read about dominant culture, counterculture, and subculture. I think I've talked enough for today about various things, but read the introduction yourself leading up to class, and you'll see in detail what I'm talking about. We're going to start in chapter 1 on Friday. So after I answer any questions people have about the approach, I'm talking about the perspective. So we've got social context, cultural context, historical context. And then just in terms of power dynamics, when you're talking about any culture, some part of the culture is dominant, and then you have a subculture, right? Subcultures exist in relation to the dominant culture, and then you have all sorts of different sections or parts or ideas that are actually trying to fight against, actively move against the dominant culture. And then that's what you call counterculture. So that's another framework we can use to understand different ideas and different movements and people and events and how they are related to each other and how things play out in British and American culture. It doesn't matter though. Obviously, as I mentioned by my anecdote or my references to Korean stuff, is you can apply this to your own country. One of the things about this class is you're going to learn a lot of stuff, a lot of information to understand better, but I think you're going to also come away from this class with some ways to look at your own culture in your own language, You're going to learn some new English words. You're going to learn improve your English, I hope. So there's multiple things that are positive or benefits from taking this class. I know it's a lot to understand. So think about it, listen to this lecture, use the subtitles, read the book, and then if you have any questions, ask me, and we'll do our best to keep everybody up to date. Okay? So don't fall behind. Read the introduction, and I'll see you on Friday. Thank you for joining the class, and this is the beginning. On Friday, we start talking about ancient Britain, and we go from there. Have a good day.